The axe handle snaps with a sound like a gunshot. 3 days deep into the wilderness, hundreds of miles from the nearest settlement, winter pressing down from the north like a slow, inevitable hand, and the only tool that stood between a man and death, gone. Just like that. Most men would panic. Most men would start calculating how far they could walk before the cold took them. Most men would spend their final days cursing the wood that failed them. But this man doesn't move. He doesn't curse. He simply kneels, turns the broken iron head over in his calloused hands, and begins to think. Because he knows something that most people have forgotten. The wilderness didn't just take from him. It was also offering something. In every stone by the creek, in every hickory trunk, in every ash tree standing in the gray morning light. The question was never, what do I have? The real question, the one that separated the men who survived from the men who didn't, was always, what do I know? And that single difference, knowledge versus equipment, is what this entire story is about. How did frontiersmen transform raw wilderness materials into functional survival tools? What techniques allowed them to work metal without a proper forge? Which natural materials provided the best foundation for tool construction? And how did they build complete tool systems capable of replacing everything they might lose? Out there, alone, with winter coming. Today, we're going inside that knowledge. The methods, the mindset, and the ancient techniques that turned the wilderness itself into a hardware store for those who knew how to read it. This is Wild America. Chapter 1. Stone Tool Mastery. When the earth itself becomes a blade. 1800, 1830. He kneels beside a creek bed, fingers trailing through cold water, eyes moving slowly across the stones beneath the surface. To an untrained eye, they all look the same. To him, they speak. There, a piece of chert, dark and fine-grained, the way light catches its edge, telling him everything he needs to know. He lifts it, turns it, and allows himself, for the first time since the handle snapped, a small measure of certainty. Stone toolmaking was the bedrock skill of every frontiersman who survived long enough to grow old. Not because it was easy. It demanded years of practiced intuition, but because it required nothing that the land didn't freely provide. The material selection was the first critical judgment. Not all stone could be worked. Frontiersmen learned to identify flint, chert, obsidian, and quartzite, each with distinct working properties. Flint and chert were most commonly available across North American creek beds and exposed ridgelines. Obsidian, found near volcanic regions of the West, was rarer, but produced edges of extraordinary sharpness. Here is the detail that stops most people cold. A properly knapped obsidian, or chert blade, can reach a cutting edge of approximately 3 nanometers thick, compared to surgical steel, which typically measures around 15 to 20 micrometers. In controlled tests, obsidian blades have been shown to cause less tissue trauma than modern steel scalpels. The frontiersmen didn't know the science, but they understood the result. The knapping technique itself was built on controlled fracture. Striking a stone core at precise angles with a hammerstone, usually a dense, rounded river rock, sent fractures propagating through the material in predictable patterns. The skill lay in reading the stone before the strike, anticipating how force would travel through its internal grain. What took years to master was pressure flaking, the refinement stage. Using a pointed tool fashioned from antler tine or dense hardwood, an experienced knapper could remove tiny, controlled flakes along an edge, shaping it with a precision that simple percussion couldn't achieve. This was how arrowheads were thinned, how knife blades were given their final geometry, how scrapers were tuned for specific hides. It is worth noting that these techniques were not invented by frontiersmen. Archaeological evidence suggests Paleo-Indian peoples across North America were producing sophisticated stone tools as far back as 13,000 years ago, with some sites suggesting even earlier occupation. What the frontiersmen did was inherit, adapt, and carry forward a lineage of knowledge that was already ancient when the first European boots touched American soil. Heat treatment added another layer of sophistication. Certain stones, particularly chert, could be buried in dry sand and heated slowly in a fire over 24 to 48 hours, a process believed to reorganize the stone's internal silica structure. The result was a material that knapped more smoothly and held a finer edge. Whether this was fully understood as a chemical process or simply passed down as what you do, The outcome was the same: better tools. The final stage was hafting, securing the stone blade to a handle. Hide glue rendered from boiled animal scraps, pine pitch mixed with powdered charcoal, and tight wrappings of wet rawhide that shrank as they dried. These created bonds that could outlast the tools themselves. Stone tools required no fire to make, no metal, no manufactured materials of any kind. A man with knowledge and a creek bed could arm himself completely and sharpen his tools indefinitely in the field. But stone, as powerful as it was, had limits, and what he found next, buried in the remains of an old campfire pit, was about to change everything. Chapter 2. Fire, Iron, and Will. Blacksmithing without a forge. 1830-1860. Buried beneath the collapsed remains of an abandoned trapper's camp, half hidden under rotted canvas and a season's worth of fallen leaves, lay 3 pieces of scrap iron. To most eyes, they were garbage, broken, useless. The kind of thing a man walks past without a second glance. He didn't walk past, because he understood something fundamental about iron that most people in the modern world have completely lost. Metal doesn't forget its potential. It only waits for someone with the knowledge and the will to remind it what it can become. Improvised metalwork was perhaps the most powerful survival skill a frontiersman could carry, not because it was the most common. Stone and wood were worked far more often, but because when a man could reshape iron without a forge, without a proper anvil, without a blacksmith shop within 500 miles, he had crossed into a category of self-sufficiency that very few could claim. The fire came first, not just any fire. A metalworking fire demanded sustained, concentrated heat, far beyond what a standard campfire could produce. Frontiersmen learned to construct specialized fire pits, deep, narrow channels that concentrated combustion, packed with hardwood charcoal rather than raw wood. Hardwood charcoal burns hotter and cleaner, capable of sustaining temperatures in the range of 1,100 to 1,300 degrees Celsius, the threshold at which iron becomes workable. They reached these temperatures without instruments, without gauges. Heat was read by color alone. Black iron meant cold. Deep red meant warm. Bright orange meant working temperature. Yellow-white meant danger, the metal approaching its burning point. They were reading fire the way a musician reads rhythm, by feel, by instinct built through repetition. The bellows were improvised from whatever the wilderness offered. Leather bags stitched tight and fitted with hollow bone nozzles. In some documented accounts, frontiersmen used dried animal bladders, particularly from elk or bison, as air chambers, creating forced draft systems capable of pushing a fire well beyond what natural airflow alone could sustain. The precise mechanics varied by region and by man. What didn't vary was the underlying principle: iron needs oxygen as much as it needs heat. The anvil was stone, specifically dense, fine-grained granite or quartzite, rock hard enough to resist deformation under hammer blows without fracturing. A flat-faced boulder, positioned at working height, served the same fundamental purpose as a 100-pound forged steel anvil. The physics didn't change simply because the equipment was improvised. Hammers came from what was available: river-worn stones hafted with green hickory, pieces of scrap iron used to shape other pieces of scrap iron. In the hands of a man who understood the principles of drawing, upsetting, and bending metal, the tool mattered far less than the knowledge directing it. Hardening and tempering transformed soft-worked iron into functional tool steel. Heating a blade to critical temperature, indicated by a specific cherry red color, then quenching it rapidly in water or oil, created a hard but brittle edge. Tempering followed, reheating to a lower temperature, then allowing it to cool slowly, relieving internal stress while preserving hardness. This two-stage process, understood intuitively by experienced frontiersmen, is the same fundamental metallurgical principle used in modern tool manufacturing today. Iron doesn't lie. It doesn't soften to spare your feelings. It reflects, with perfect honesty, the quality of attention you bring to it. A broken axe head became a functional tool again. Scrap iron became knife blades, trap components, fire strikers, and tool reinforcements. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was beyond recovery, for a man who knew what he was doing. But iron and stone, as powerful as they were in combination, still couldn't do everything the wilderness demanded. The most abundant raw material of all, the one literally surrounding him on every side, required a completely different kind of mastery, and that mastery had been quietly perfected over thousands of years, long before the first frontiersmen ever set foot in these mountains. Chapter 3. What the Forest Gives Freely. Wood, Bone, and Ancient Memory. 1860-1880. He stood at the edge of the tree line and looked into the forest the way another man might look at a hardware store. Not with desperation, with inventory. Every species of tree around him had a specific purpose. Every animal he had taken for food had left behind materials that, in the right hands, became tools. The forest wasn't empty of resources, it was full of them, waiting for someone who had been taught to see. This was perhaps the most important perceptual shift that separated experienced frontiersmen from men who died in the wilderness with resources all around them. The wilderness didn't withhold, it simply required a different kind of literacy. Wood selection was the first language to learn. Hardwoods carried the structural load. Oak, hickory, and ash were the preferred choices for handles, hafts, and load-bearing components. Hickory in particular was valued for its combination of hardness and flexibility, its ability to absorb shock without splitting, qualities that made it the dominant handle wood across American frontier tool culture well into the late 19th century. Softer woods, pine, cedar, basswood, served different roles. Lighter implements, insulation materials, friction fire components. The critical variable that most beginners ignored was moisture content. Green wood was easy to carve but would crack and warp as it dried, destroying the precise fits that tool construction demanded. Frontiersmen learned accelerated seasoning techniques, controlled exposure to fire heat, burial in dry ash, or careful positioning near consistent heat sources that could reduce drying time from months to days without compromising structural integrity. Joint construction determined whether a composite tool would hold under real working conditions or fail at the worst possible moment. Mortise and tenon joints cut by hand, wooden pins driven through aligned holes, lashings of wet rawhide that, as they dried, contracted around joints with extraordinary compressive force, creating connections that were sometimes stronger than the materials they bound together. There is something that happens to a man when he sits carving wood by firelight while snow falls outside. Something quiets. The mind stops arguing with circumstance and begins, instead, to solve it. Bone extended the tool system into territory wood alone couldn't reach. The skeletal remains of hunted deer, elk, and bison provided material for awls, needles, scrapers, and specialized cutting implements. Different bones carried different working properties. Dense leg bones for tools requiring hardness and durability. Flatter shoulder blades for scrapers and cutting surfaces. Antler occupied a unique category. Deer and elk antler possessed a combination of hardness, toughness, and workability that made it exceptionally valuable for precision toolmaking. What is particularly striking, and what many accounts from this period suggest, though the precise mechanisms weren't scientifically understood at the time, is that antler could be made significantly more pliable by sustained boiling, allowing it to be bent and shaped before rehardening as it cooled. This property made antler ideal for curved tool components, hook shapes, and complex geometries that straight bone or wood couldn't easily provide. It is worth acknowledging that these techniques did not originate with European-American frontiersmen. Archaeological and anthropological evidence indicates that Native American peoples, across dozens of distinct cultural traditions, had developed sophisticated wood and bone tool technologies, spanning thousands of years before European contact. What frontiersmen absorbed, often through direct interaction with indigenous communities, was the distilled product of millennia of accumulated material knowledge. The debt, historically speaking, was substantial. Composite construction brought everything together. A knife might combine a stone or metal blade, a hickory handle, a rawhide binding, and a pine pitch adhesive. 4 different materials, each contributing a specific property the others couldn't provide. These weren't crude improvisations. They were sophisticated engineering solutions, built from available components. But knowing how to make individual tools, even exceptional ones, was still only half the equation. The other half was something far more difficult to teach. It was the ability to think in systems, to see not just the tool in front of you, but the complete workshop that could sustain life indefinitely, built from nothing, in the middle of nowhere. Chapter 4. The Invisible Workshop. Building Self-Sufficiency from Nothing. 1880-1900. He stepped back from his work and looked at what 3 days had produced. A stone scraper, pressure flake to a precise working angle, 2 bone needles, smooth and sharp enough to pass through cured leather without resistance, a hickory handle, fitted and bound to the restored iron axe head with rawhide lashing and pine pitch, already drying hard in the cold air, a fire pit designed specifically for metalwork, positioned to use the prevailing wind as a natural bellows, not a collection of desperate improvisations, a system. And that distinction between random tools and an intentional system was what ultimately separated the frontiersmen who merely survived from those who genuinely thrived in the deep wilderness for years, sometimes decades, at a time. The workshop mentality began with hierarchy. Not all tools were equal in urgency. The experienced frontiersman understood that certain tools enabled the creation of other tools, that the sequence in which implements were produced determined everything that followed. A cutting tool came first, because without it, nothing else could be shaped. A fire-making kit came second, because without controlled heat, metal and bone and wood remained raw and unworkable. Each subsequent tool expanded capability, and expanded capability meant expanded survival margin. Raw material stockpiling transformed temporary camp into sustainable base. Frontiersmen with long wilderness experience developed the instinct to collect and store suitable stone, scrap metal, seasoned wood, and processed bone whenever these materials were encountered in abundance, not because they were needed immediately, but because scarcity in winter was as predictable as winter itself. This forward-thinking resource management bears a striking resemblance to the material procurement strategies documented among ancient civilizations, from Neolithic European settlements to indigenous North American communities, suggesting that certain principles of survival logistics may be essentially universal across human cultures, regardless of geography or era. A man with good tools and the knowledge to make more is never truly helpless in the wilderness. That line was written by mountain man Jim Bridger, one of the most documented figures of the American frontier era, sometime around 1860, according to accounts recorded by contemporaries. Whether the exact wording is precisely as history remembers it remains a matter of some scholarly debate, but the sentiment was real. It was lived, not theorized. Specialization emerged naturally within frontier communities. Some men developed exceptional skill in stonework. Others became known for their metalwork. Still others were the ones you came to for woodcraft and joinery. These informal specializations created trade networks, finished tools exchanged for raw materials, technical knowledge shared across winter camps that functioned, in their own way, like the guild systems of medieval European craft traditions. The emergency protocols were perhaps the most revealing measure of true mastery. When primary methods failed, when stone was unavailable, when fire couldn't be sustained, when materials were critically scarce, the master frontiersman didn't stop. He compressed, he simplified, he produced cruder tools faster, accepting reduced performance in exchange for speed of production, then refined them when conditions allowed. The system was never rigid. It breathed with circumstance. And standing there, looking at what 3 days in raw wilderness had produced, he understood something that no manufactured tool could ever teach. The wilderness had not failed him when the axe handle broke. It had simply asked him a question, the only question the wilderness ever really asks. Are you paying attention? The legacy that outlasted the frontier. We live in an age that has made forgetting easy. Every tool we need arrives pre-made, pre-sharpened, pre-packaged, delivered to our doors before we have ever had to consider what it would mean to produce one ourselves. And for most of daily life, that is a remarkable thing, a genuine miracle of logistics and civilization. But there is a cost to that convenience that rarely gets discussed. When the supply chain breaks, and history suggests, with uncomfortable regularity, that supply chains do break, the question the wilderness asked those frontiersmen becomes suddenly, urgently personal. What do you actually know how to do? The frontiersmen whose stories we've explored today weren't remarkable because they were physically stronger than other men, or braver, or born with some innate gift the rest of us lack. They were remarkable because they carried knowledge, patient, accumulated, practiced knowledge, that transformed their relationship with scarcity. Where other men saw crisis, they saw material. Where others saw the end of options, they saw the beginning of a process. That capacity, to look at raw circumstance and extract function from it, is not a 19th century skill. It is a human skill, one that has been practiced on every continent, Across every era of human existence, wherever people have faced the fundamental challenge of surviving with only what the land provides, it didn't die with the frontier. It waited. The question is whether we're still paying attention. If this is the kind of history that makes you think differently about the world you live in, the kind that connects ancient knowledge to modern questions, subscribe to Wild America. Every week, we go deeper into the skills, the stories, and the people that built this country from the ground up. We'll see you in the wilderness.